Sigmund Freud, very important figure, 19th to 20th century psychoanalyst from Vienna. His major contribution to modern culture is not so much his psychoanalytic theories, many of which have been debunked and don't hold much water, at least within the psychoanalytic establishment today. I think his major contribution is his anthropology, that he sees human beings as fundamentally motivated by dark sexual desire. And I think there's a twofold dimension to that that's of interest to us today. One, I think it has to be said, he's onto something. Human history is littered with the damage created by uncontrolled human sexual desire. It's the reason why we can read the Iliad, or we can read the great Arthurian epics about Arthur, Lancelot, and Guinevere today. And even though they were written in very alien worlds to ours, they make sense because we understand the irrational, powerful, destructive nature of sexual desire. And the second dimension of that is Freud really lays down the theoretical framework for thinking of ourselves in terms of sexual desire. When somebody says, I'm gay, they're not necessarily making any claim about having had any sexual experience with somebody else. They're simply talking about how they experience the direction of their sexual desire. That makes sense to us in a way that it would not have made sense 500 years ago. Why does it make sense to us? Because Freud's notion that we are, if you like, constituted by the nature of our sexual desire has become an integral part of the social imaginary. Freud, I think, offers two things to us today. One of them is he helps us understand why society has come to think about sexual desire as fundamental to identity. He's touching on something deep and true there, even if he articulates it in terms of an anthropology that has no place for sin or the fall. So as a Christian, I would look to Freud and saying he's correct in his analysis of fallen humanity. He would reject the category of fallen. But I think Freud works if you transpose him into a category of fallen humanity. Second thing that Freud puts his finger on is this, that sexual codes, the rules by which we regulate society's sexual behavior, are extremely important. Freud, in many ways, was not a particularly liberal or libertarian person on the sexual front. He saw the need for clear sexual control. He knew that rules that controlled sexuality would mean that human beings were never fully happy. But that was a price we paid for a better chance of survival. If you have no sexual morality, no rules corralling sexual behavior, you end up with an anarchic society where strong, dominant males go around raping women at will, and the world is hell on earth for everybody. And those strong, dominant males don't last very long because they get weak and new strong, dominant males come along. So Freud knew that sexual codes were important for what he called civilization, what I might call culture. When you think in those terms, you then realize that when a society changes its sexual codes, something very fundamental is going on in that society. We can change rules about speed limits on federal highways or the age for legal consumption of alcohol. We can change the rules and they'll make some small difference to society. When you fundamentally change the sexual codes and practices by which a society regulates itself, you're changing the society at its very heart. And that makes the last 20, 30 years of Western history and the next 20, 30 years of Western history a very interesting and a very frightening place to be, because we are doing something, we are overturning all standard sexual codes at an incredible speed. And if Freud is correct, that could easily plunge our societies into total chaos. The big question the church faces on many of these issues surrounding sexuality and gender is the question of what does it mean to be a human being? Are these changes consistent with a biblical anthropology, or do they undermine a biblical anthropology in some way? Wilhelm Reich is a significant figure for understanding how sexuality became so politicized in the 20th century. There's a sense in which once you make the Freudian move and once you decide that sexual desire is identity, sex has to become politicized because rules that were set forth to restrict sexual behavior will be understood as restricting legitimate identities. So the Freudian move is going to lead to a political move on the sexual front. Reich is the man who does that theoretically in a very compelling way in the 1930s. And what Reich does is he really marries two thinkers that aren't really very compatible, but he successfully brings them together. The figures of Sigmund Freud and Karl Marx. And what he takes from Freud is that sexual codes are very important. What he takes from Marx is this, that moral codes always serve the economic status quo. So what Reich does in some ways is historicize Freud. And he says, yes, Freud is right, for example, that incest is wrong. What Freud doesn't understand is that we have these codes merely to support the bourgeois capitalist way of life. Reich then makes the next move, and that's this, and it's, so if we want to break bourgeois capitalism, we have to tear down the sexual codes that support it. We have to, in other words, destroy the sexual codes that support the strong nuclear family. Reich is writing this in the 1930s. He will die in the 1950s. His thinking will become powerful in the West in the 1960s. 1968, the student revolutions in Europe and America, Reich's writings are reappropriated by a new generation of revolutionaries who focus their attention not simply on, we might say, economic oppression, but also on sexual oppression as well. And it's at that time that we see things like radical feminism and what will later become the LGBTQ, but was then sort of the gay rights movement starting to emerge.
You need a little fee in your life. You need a little me in your life. I want to see the sea in your eyes. You need to be free.